everybody, you join me today for yet another video in my Ferrari 430 Scuderia. I've had this car for coming up to 4 months now, and in that time I have covered over 4,000 miles. Yep, when I picked this car up it was on 22,000 pretty much exactly. In fact, my first test drive in this car, it was sat on precisely that mileage. Now it's over 26,000, which means I've put on this car the equivalent of about the last, well, I think 4 or 5 years worth of mileage on it in a very short space of time. And that has got me thinking about something which I really don't like thinking about, but maybe I should a little bit more. And that's how many miles should I be putting on my Ferrari. My first instinct is probably the same as yours, which is as many miles as you possibly can. However, it's not quite as simple as that, so I thought I'd use the opportunity today to drive you down a possibly familiar but very pretty road for a little bit and talk about the topic in some more detail. There are several elements to this. First off, how much is it really actually a problem? Secondly, why is it a problem? And thirdly, what can you really do about it? So first off, why is it a problem? And I think it's particularly a problem here in the United Kingdom. I think there's a lot of people still around who remember when cars were built with 5-digit odometers, because the idea of any British-made vehicle getting to 100,000 miles without simply melting was just unthinkable. I still speak to people who replace their car almost ritually every 3 or 4 years, because back in the 70s, that's simply how long you would have got out of it before it disintegrated. That clearly is not the case anymore, but still the problem persists. There's almost certainly going to be an element of psychology in here too, because 100,000 miles is quite a lot. I would say the majority of cars people drive, if they're newer cars, are less than 10 years old, are not on 100,000 miles. However, in the continent, in places like Australia, Japan, where you use kilometers, that's very easy to get to. 100,000 kilometers is not really a particularly spectacular number. 200,000 kilometers is then obviously quite a bit more, and I'm sure a 200,000 kilometer car is maybe viewed the same way as a 100,000 mile car. But the fact is, 100,000 Ks is only 60,000 miles, and nothing modern should really be even remotely close to worn out by then. Because I'm using my Ferrari as the backdrop today, of course, that really is the brand that I've got in mind. A little bit worried there, because the last time I drove through here was in a Challenge Scuderia, and it did tap the deck there a couple of times, so I was taking it quite easy. This car also likes to smack the ground on occasion, and when it does it, it's really, really horrible. It makes an awful racket. Anyway, I think there are two really basic, quite simple reasons why people don't generally drive their Ferraris. The first is they simply don't have the time. A Ferrari is a very expensive thing, by and large, and that means in order to have got one, you've probably been working a lot, or very hard, or for quite a long time. Most of the people that I know who have a car like this are a working professional of some description, and they just don't really have a lot of spare time on their hands. That means that opportunities to actually use their beloved car are very few and far between. I've known quite a few people who had these cars over, say, decades, and they haven't put more than a few thousand miles on, not for lack of desire, but simply lack of opportunity. Of course, on the other side of things, you'll have those people who've got loads and loads and loads of money and loads of time, but maybe they've also got loads and loads of cars, and that means they're going to be splitting their mileage between them. You'll find that they too probably have a bit of a daily hack that they just stick the boring miles on, so they leave the other stuff for occasions and events. There's nothing, I think, inherently really wrong with that. And on the other side, you've got the people who could use their car but don't want to. And they're the ones really I'm mostly talking about today, because those are the people who are afraid of devaluing their car if they drive it. That's a great philosophical debate, isn't it? You have a beautiful, gorgeous car whose fame comes really from how good it is to drive. Yet, If you drive it, it will be worth less. It will cost you money. To me, the idea that driving a Ferrari will cost you money shouldn't really come as much of a revelation. However, I'd say over the last sort of 5 to 6 years in particular, the car market has changed, and I think may be changing back. You see, about 15 years ago, you could buy any number of old Ferraris relatively cheaply. Even something like a Testarossa or a Dino wasn't actually going to be that expensive. But we all knew that maintaining them wasn't cheap. They drank fuel, they ate parts, labour rates at your Ferrari dealer were high, etc, etc. So really, what kept a lot of people from buying these cars wasn't the fact that they thought they couldn't afford to buy them, but the fact they knew they couldn't afford to run them. And those who wanted to show off would go and buy the latest and the greatest. And if you did want the newest Ferrari, within the first 2 years they'd hold their money fairly well, but after that they would suffer quite a lot of depreciation. It wasn't entirely unlike what McLarens have been doing for the last few years. New car, really expensive, loses loads of money reasonably quickly, but then kind of plateaus and stays there, and people are generally put off by the fact that it's a really expensive thing to keep going. But in the last few years, we've seen supercar prices stabilise, finance become a lot more accessible, and that means demand has gone up. As you're talking about items which have already been produced, supply really is a sort of fixed item. And the moment people wanted to start bidding against the same car, your prices go up, and this means your residuals go up, which means financing them becomes even cheaper, and the cycle carries on until you find people paying the same for a 13-year-old car as they did when it was new. What kind of idiot would do that? But even with finance readily available, cars being somewhat in demand, we still have this chasm and price difference between what's not actually a really high mileage car. In terms of high mileage, a 430 Scuderia, you're talking about 30,000 miles. I recall an article from a few years ago in Evo magazine where they said, you know, look, a 10,000 mile Scuderia and a 30,000 mile Scuderia, there'd be nearly £100,000 of price difference between the two. And if you took the car over 30,000 miles, it would be near impossible to sell no matter what you priced it at. Now, I think there's a little bit of poetic license taken with that, because I have a suspicion if I put another 20,000 miles on this car and took it to say 46,000 and then I tried to sell it for say 140 grand, pretty sure someone would buy it. This is one of the best specified Scuderias I have ever seen on sale, and despite the fact that it's obviously got the miles on it, it's in very good condition, has got an excellent history with it, is in to some people a fairly desirable colour combo, although I'm entirely indifferent to it. And so there'll be someone out there that wants it. It's a right-hand drive car too, and in Ferrari land that means it is going to be worth a bit more money. To give you an idea, the cheapest Scuderia out there at the minute in right-hand drive I think's about 175 grand, so what I paid for this. The cheapest left-hand drive does have some more miles, it's on about 33,000 miles, and that's £135,000. So you're talking easily about a sort of 40 to 50k real-world difference between, you know, a like-for-like left and right-hand drive car. At the time of filming, a 430 Scuderia up for sale at Dick Love at Swindon, where I got this, with only 6,000 miles on it. It is in yellow, which is spectacular. I have seen the car, it's gorgeous. But it doesn't have all the toys this one has. And because it's on 6,000 miles, that car is up for £215,000. That's a lot. A heck of a lot. So that's 40,000 quid more than this for a less than 20,000 mile difference. In fact, closer to a 15,000 mile difference. What are you talking? Yeah, it's 6, carry the 10 with a 16,000 mile difference between the two cars. And is that one really going to be any better than this? Shouldn't be. In theory, all cars should be prepped to the same standard, especially at a Ferrari main dealer. Yes, I know, it doesn't always happen. Done a video on that if you want to watch it. They should have both been maintained. If anything, the car with the higher miles on will have been maintained a little bit more frequently. When cars don't get driven quite as much, there's this temptation to not service them as often. I remember seeing a thread on Piston Heads not too long back where someone was looking at an 8,000 mile 355. So you're talking about a 25-year-old car. And he was really upset at the fact that it had a 10-year gap in the service history, which, to be honest, wasn't really a gap because it wasn't like the mileage was missing between services. It just hadn't been serviced for 10 years. He thought it was going to have been serviced every single year. How dare the owners not service it on an annual basis? Well, the truth is that that car probably wasn't serviced for 10 years because it probably didn't go anywhere for 10 years. How else do you think you get to a car that's 25 years old with only 8,000 miles on the clock? Especially if you're expecting them to be genuine miles, and Ferraris being clocked is a thing that happens. It is actually shockingly easy to do on some of the older ones. Really, you could do it with almost no time or effort at all. And I know exactly how that sort of thing happens. I know why these cars only get serviced every few years. If that chap had bought that car, I'll tell you exactly what would have happened. He'd have got it, he'd have taken delivery, he'd have taken it out quickly, and then suddenly realised that in a day he did 120 miles. Oh my goodness, blimey, that's loads. I'm going to be depreciating it. I best not drive it anymore. So every now and again he'd go and look at it, have a beer in the garage with it, but be so afraid of taking it anywhere, he just wouldn't use it. He'd wait until the perfect day came and then realised he lives in England and the perfect day almost never comes. So the next year would roll around and he'd think, oh, I could get that car serviced, but it's not cheap servicing a Ferrari. It's still going to be £700 or £800 for a basic service on a 355. And he'd go, yeah, you know what? It's only done 300 miles. There's no point really servicing it. Then the next year would roll around and maybe the car had travelled another 200 miles and he'd think more or less the same thing. And then 3 years would have passed and he might actually go, you know what? Cam belts do need doing. I'll get them done. Hey presto, car goes 3 years between services. In all honesty, if you are looking at a Ferrari and you're put off by big intervals between services, stop looking, because that's just what happens. And provided the cam belt on the car isn't currently ancient, there's not really that much danger of anything going wrong. Weirdly, as cars then age, you do get to a stage where I find they exist in almost binary states. So you get those ultra low mile cars. Do you remember that McLaren F1 from a few years back, which was essentially still in the shrink wrap? It's practically still in the box. It had the seat covers still on it from delivery and everything. That's an unused, undriven car. The fact is, if you did actually want to use it, you'd probably spend, well, with a McLaren F1, probably 50 or 100 grand simply recommissioning it so you could actually drive it. And then the minute you did, you'd have devalued it massively, because that car's value is in the fact it's not been driven. Much as if you're going to buy an older car and you want to choose between a standard and a modified example. If you buy a standard car of something particularly rare and unusual, especially if there are not many standard ones left, then you do kind of have to keep it standard, because part of its value was in the fact it hadn't been modified. So cars like that McLaren F1, 1,000-mile Ferraris, stuff like that, those are cars which you're going to buy as a piece of art. You can't drive them, you can't do anything with them. They'd be absolutely awful as an investment and probably as a car as well. And then you get the ones you can use, which by that stage is essentially all of the others out for sale. But cars like this really perplex me, because for something, say, like an F40, I think if you found one out there with 500,000 miles on it, somebody would buy it. Probably somebody called Scott, if I'm being honest. However, with much younger cars, it does seem like you could almost put so many miles on the car that it would have no value at all. And that to me is just utterly and totally bizarre. If you blindfolded to me and put me in that other 6,000 mile Scuderia, I would like to think I couldn't tell a difference at all. In fact, if there were any, it'd probably be in things you can change very easily, like the tyres or the geometry. But the weirdest thing is, I keep speaking to people who are real driving enthusiasts, people that buy these cars because they want to use them, because they do want to take them out there, and then they go looking for really low mile examples. And I hate to break some hearts here, but very often those, especially if it's a car that's say 10 to 20 years old, might actually not be very good. I know a lot of people in, say, the Porsche world, and we used to talk about the 944s, which had a 5-digit odometer. And with the old 944s, every single one of them seemed to be on 22,000 miles. The difference, of course, was some of them really were on 22,000 miles, and the rest were on 122,000. The fact was, the one you wanted was the one that was on 122,000, because first off, it meant nobody was trying to hide the fact it had done the miles. Secondly, it had been maintained, it had been used, it had regular oil changes, belt changes, everything else. It was a better car. And the maddest thing of all is that these same people who want to buy a car to use go and get a low mileage one because that's the one they thought was the most desirable, and then suddenly find themselves unwilling to use it. Bonkers, absolutely bonkers. I try and take the opposite approach. I try and find the highest mileage example that I'd be happy with, knowing that I can probably safely put quite a few more miles on it. Putting 20,000 miles on this is probably going to cost me a hell of a lot less than putting 20,000 miles on that yellow one, because in theory that yellow one would then be worth the same as this. If I were to take 40 grand off the price of this, it would then be the same as the cheapest left-hand drive up for sale currently, and I think really it would be worth more than that. Of course, you then kept putting miles on the yellow one, it's still going to keep depreciating, it's still going to keep going down, so it's just absolute nonsense. So that, I think, is two parts of the question answered. Why people don't drive these cars with low miles on, and whether there's actually any real reason to. They're afraid to, they're worried about losing money, and no, there isn't any reason to not drive your low mileage, lovely Ferrari. What can we actually do about it? Well, I take the car out, I use it, I enjoy it, I make these videos in the hope that one day people will realise that actually, you know what, you can really use these things, you can drive them, you can enjoy them, and, not to put too fine a point on it, I basically get the market to work for me, in that I go, okay, the situation is that people are happy to pay a hell of a lot more money for a car with what's a token amount fewer miles. Any other brand, 20,000 miles difference wouldn't really change all that much. With Ferraris, some limited edition Porsches, Lamborghinis, that sort of stuff, it apparently is a really, really big deal, and from where I'm sat, I just don't think it is. So I therefore buy the high mile examples and have a car that I'm less worried about enjoying. I'll confess, this morning I wasn't sure what car to take because I've driven quite a way. I've done about 150 miles today, and I didn't initially want to take the Ferrari, and I thought, oh God, am I going to enjoy it? Should I have? I don't know. I was going to go and look at another car, and I didn't want to go and look at that in the Ferrari because it's not really very good to haggle if you turn up in a 430 Scuderia. And when I turned up, the chap really loved the car. His neighbours and their kids loved the car. We all had a good chat about the car, and I felt great about having brought my car out. It was a wonderful day. It's a wonderful experience, even though it's actually starting to rain now. I'm really, really enjoying driving this car. I'm not giving it hell for leather. I'm just having a bit of fun, and it is so much fun. I like to think of these things as sort of an investment, but the return I expect from my investment isn't a financial one. The return I expect is in fun, is in memories, is in smiles, shared experiences. And as far as that goes, this is an absolutely fabulous investment, one of the best I think I've ever made. And as I'm quite liking this car, I think all I can really do is maybe hang on to it, and eventually one day it'll get to that point where suddenly it's just a massively desirable classic Ferrari, and nobody will really care that it's got a few more miles on than another one. They'll start caring more about the history, the condition of it, the specification of it, its originality, all these sort of other things people talk about for real, proper, 50-year-old classics. And when that day comes around, I'll probably feel a hell of a lot better for having driven it, because at that stage it might not really be worth that much more money. And let's be honest here, whoever sat there with their dying breath said, I shouldn't have driven that Ferrari as much. Anyway, that's enough for a ramble today, I think. Please like, comment down below, subscribe if you haven't already, and I shall see you for the next one. Bye-bye.